Alright, what's boppin' people? We're back. And we got this fun little thread right here. The personal VR. This thread's always interesting because you always get to see like some really wild takes. But it's also a way for people to give a complete display words. It gives people a way for them to completely display their interpretation of the metagame all in one post, and that can be harder to do in other threads like just the normal VR thread where you're making certain nominations for Pokemon to rise or drop. It can be hard to do in like the metagame discussion thread where a lot of the time posts are centralized around a certain topic. Usually you don't get a whole lot of time where people just speak about the meta at whole. Usually it's like, oh, look at NU banned Slush Rush, let's talk about the ramifications of that, or hey, let's talk about this Pokemon that's been getting talked about of being potentially OP, here's why I think that it should be suspect tested or not. Things like that are how oh wow, look, wait, he linked a post of mine? Oh, it's my personal VR from last gen. Let's see. How bad did any of these takes age? No, so far it looks like most of these takes are moderately reasonable. Oh, Victory Bell. Oh, Miss Magician C. Never mind, let me get away from that. Woo, that's bad. Anyhow, this gives you a way for you to just say, here's what I think about everything at once. Fight me on it. And so I'm gonna talk about it. Now, something I want to talk about at the beginning is you'll notice that in A+, I have like 10 Pokemon. Okay, it's only 8 because I moved a couple down. Originally I also had Xatu and Diancie in A+, but I moved them down. I think right now the NU meta is super top heavy because as it stands, team building, despite the Slush Rush ban, which I might make a video on, I might not. I'm definitely very tired of talking about it in the policy review thread. But I think right now, because of the dominance of a couple wall breakers, in particular Goodra, Copperajah, Dragalge, and Sylveon Ground, the metagame is super focused around, I feel, a very specific way of building. And that's not to say you can't venture out of that. I also just realized that I forgot a certain person to rank down here. Where is he? It'd be right here. Executor Alola. Can't forget to rank him. Now he's down here, right? Ah, I forgot this bug. Whatever. Anyhow, because the metagame's so focused around that specific, like stopping that specific set of offensive Pokemon, I do find that a lot of teams, at least when you're building balance or bulky offense, can start to look a little bit samey. You have some people that build a bit differently, I would say, than how I do. And so they've got a little bit different of rankings as you get to like around this area. That explains kind of how they're able to find a lot more consistent structures that still more or less do the same thing that you'd want how I build to do, but use different Pokemon. That's just kind of how Mons works. And so, when I was trying to figure out these top rankings, I actually had a pretty difficult time doing so, because, like with S rank, I was like, do I need an S- rank? Because like I still think Rotomo is really good, and Copperajah is insane, and Dragalge's also pretty great. And I was like, okay, so who's my S ranks? You know, I'm still pretty sold on Talonflame being one of the best mons in the tier. I think Goodra's probably the best offensive Pokemon, like at large. You know, where does Sylveon Ground play into this? But I eventually settled on Goodra and Talon being my top 2. I think Goodra's pretty easily the best breaker in the tier, and it's for a combination of things. You can look at other similar breakers. I would say Copperajah, Dragalge being the 2 most comparable. The main thing Goodra has over them is speed. All 3 of these still provide an immense amount to a team defensively through just like bulk and even typing. When you look at the context of NU, these typings that these Pokemon have is really good. Goodra Gigalge being able to check foes like Salazzle and Rotomo, and even like the other grass types. Goodra doesn't check Serena as well, but Gigalge doesn't either. But you get the point, right? They check very similar Pokemon, and I mean, they do the same thing pretty much offensively. The main thing, though, that Goodra ends up having for it is that speed, and that's really crucial, because the speed tiers around base, like, 65 to 85, I would say, are really congested. Gigalge just ends up getting to miss out on all of that up there, but Goodra gets to have a leg up on a good bit of that, you know, contested area over foes like Tyrantrum and Sirfetch'd and Exploud even, for instance, while still outspeeding all the same defensive Pokemon that Gigalge does, and applying about the same amount of pressure to them. Vaporeon would be the main one you come to think about here. Gigalge has to just fish for Sludge Bomb poisons versus it, whereas Goodra can just trivially like threaten a 2-hit KO as it switches in, depending on the Vaporeon's special bulk investment. And I think that speed is really where Goodra ends up shining most, along with coverage being a little bit easier to figure, because I think Gigalge having so much to decide with its last move slot can be a bit of a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it means, hey, you've got a lot of options that you can go with. You got Toxic Spikes to support certain teammates. You've got Protect if you just want to help your own longevity. You've got Focus Blast if you want to dent Copperajah. You got Scald if you just want general utility against the other steals. But Goodra's just able to, I think, a lot more easily decide like what constitutes counterplay to it. You could run like Iron Tail to bunk Diancie. You could run Sludge Bomb to have just a way to hit Sylveon without missing, really. You can have Hydro Pump if you want to target Diancie as well. I think it also hits a couple of more niche Pokemon for super effective damage, albeit not overly reliable damage still because of the mischance. It's just got a lot more going on there, and I think also Goodra is just a lot easier to. I was gonna say it's easier to use. Gigalge is flip turn. I just think Goodra basically does the same stuff though as Gigalge, is what I'm getting at. At least from like a breaking standpoint. It just also has the extra speed, which is what really puts it, in my eyes at least, a little bit above it. A little bit above Gigalge. As I'd say, Gigalge is not still great. Obviously, I have it in A+. I think the utility it offers ends up being really good. Having that slow flip turn to support, you know, other offensive Pokemon on your team is really good. Silvally Ground comes to mind as a Pokemon that really benefits from being paired with Gigalge, just because you don't want that Pokemon taking too much chip damage, and I think that's really valuable. I'm not going to talk too much about Gigalge because I already went decently at length with it with Goodra, but I think it's a, you know, it's a comparably great offensive Pokemon for many of the same reasons as Goodra. It's really easy to break teams with because adaptability, Draco Meteor. That's really all you need to say there. And even Specs has gotten a little bit better, at least, in lieu of Bronzong leaving. Like, realistically, you're still breaking about the same efficiency. Debatably, you have a little bit harder of a time because you can't hit the Escabulators for super effective damage. Whereas with Bronzong, you could at least Shadow Ball it. But it is one less Steel type to worry about, and it's the only Steel type that NU has really had that would run a recovery move, even though it was Rest. You know, still a Mon that was a bit more of an annoying stop to your Draco. And like we also talked about Copperajah, it's just back now being an absolutely terrifying wall breaker. Not having to worry about Bronzong blanking you, more or less, is really helpful. Just the standard Heavy Slam, Power Whip, Superpower, Stone Edge set really goes in. Talonflame, you know, it can try to pivot around you, I guess, and just pray it never gets caught by Stone Edge. Mudsdale's not too bad. Whip isn't a 2-hit KO because of stamina. But, you know, you just took over half from a Power Whip, and you don't get to switch it again the second time. I think Rest Mudsdale is actually not that bad, partly because it helps ease up the Raja matchup a little bit. And of course, Superpower being able to snipe stuff like Guzzlord and Snorlax is quite big as well. Now we can talk about the competitor Escavalier too. I think Bronzong leaving has definitely helped Kaparaji just get back in contention with Escav. But Escavalier is still great as well. It's hard to say whether Escavalier is better or worse defensively than Kaparaja, because Escavalier is more vulnerable to Fire-type coverage from the likes of Goodra, offensive Sylveon, Mystical Fire Diancie, and some others. But it's still really good overall. I think the main reason ends up being that knockoff is very hard to punish from it. You got a lot of chances to come in just throughout the course of battle. A lot of Pokemon let you in for free, so you're talking like Wish Tech Sylveons. Most Vileplume can't really do a whole lot to you. I'm coming on some Diancie variants because they're still not always running Mystical Fire. And then just still as a Steel type, despite fearing fire coverage, doesn't mean you can't switch into Goodra. Just means you can't switch into Fire Blast, right? Something about top tier Pokemon is they're always going to be a little bit vulnerable to getting lured. That doesn't make them much worse, though. You know, it's like Diancie can get lured by Iron Tail Goodra. Cool. Okay. I mean, the Mon's there to at least dissuade Goodra from Dracoing something else, I guess. You know? You can pivot on a Draco or any other move, and then you threaten it out. Now, if you're not offensive, Moonblast ain't really going to threaten to Oko Goodra, but you still get a lot of damage off on it. And Escavalier's sort of similar. You know, you talk about like other breakers like Exploud, where you're like, oh, well, Overheat Oko's it. I'm like, okay, Overheat does like 80 to Copper Raja as well. We still consider Raja a better check to it because it, you know, tanks that hit. Escavalier dies to Overheat, yeah, but it still pivots in on Boom Burst. And that's really like the first step to winning that matchup, right? Deny Exploud from being able to make the same progress that it would otherwise be making. And of course, Escavalier's also got just a lot that it can do, which makes it... I don't want to say that it's like, oh, it's super flexible and fits on a whole bunch of different teams, because it really doesn't. You know, it's always like on balanced, bulky offense. It's more that Escavalier lets you kind of tech other... You know, it gives you more leverage with your other Pokemon. And it still does, I guess, it gives you some more leeway with your other slots. So, like, you could do, like, CB Escav if you're able to fit competent counterplay to the normal and dragon types elsewhere, right? You could do like SD Protect or just Protect 3 attacks. Scav's really cool, especially alongside Toxic Spikes Dragalge, for instance. I think we even saw, I think at least, Confide, Bra, and Assault Vest Escavalier versus Stresh in this week of NU Snake Draft. And, you know, he had a Wish support Sylveon with it. I think Wish support's just generally good with Escavalier, but again, it's just another example of how you can do different things with Escavalier's moveset just to, like, truly make more use out of your other teammates. And next up, we got Big Horse. Mudsdale is... this mod has been, like, S-rank or borderline S-rank the entire time it has been in NU this gen, it feels like. There was a brief period, once we got DLC 2 stuff, where Muds was, like, low A ranks. It's just back at the top. We all know what Mudsdale does. It's just really fat. It sets rocks really reliably. It's not passive really either because it's got such a good natural attack stat. So even versus like Azatu, for instance, which is going to deny rocks from you, if you catch it with a Smackdown or a Rock Slide on the switch and you start forcing it to spam Roost, your Earthquake's still doing like over 40. So it's not like Zatu's just easily roosting off the damage. No, you're going to keep forcing it to roost more and more. So you're able to really... you know, force it into a spot where its utility later on in the game isn't as great, just because it doesn't have as much recovery to work with. And of course, being one of the few Volt deterrents in the tier is still good. Rotomo is really the only relevant Volt Switch user I feel right now, with Heliolisk being, you know, a shadow of its former self. But despite it Leaf Storming you and killing you one hit, it doesn't matter. A lot of Rotomo still are running Choice Scarf, and so being able to punish the Volt Switch if you switch in on it is still really good. And also just maybe pressuring it to want to go for, you know, Trick or Leaf Storm on other turns still has some value. And I guess next we can still talk about Rotomo. One of the best Scarfers in the tier, so by proxy one of the best Revenge Killers in the tier. pretty good defogger, whether you go with like Scarf with defog as like a last move, or if you go as like not a bulky set but a bulkier set with lefties, you can get a decent amount of utility out of Rotomo there, especially with Silvally Ground being a lot better. I do think there's something to say about Rotomos that have a little bit more HP investment, Rotomos that run leftovers, or have Pain Split as an option, or just still Will-O-Wisp, but again, you're getting a little bit more bulk out of your Rotom. I feel like Nasty Plot has kind of fallen off, and Motum definitely doesn't like how good Goodra is right now, or Jagalgi or Plume. Never really liked any of that, but the nice thing about those is they don't block Volt Switch, you know? I've seen plenty of teams that I would still consider a good team that don't have a Volt Switch blocker. But, you know, it's not like I'd say they have a bad Rotomo matchup, necessarily. But at the end of the day, Rotomo still is good into those teams because it just constantly forces momentum on every turn. If it ever gets a spot where it's against a mon that it threatens out, it's pretty free to just Volt Switch. And there's nothing you can do about it, and your opponent constantly has the upper hand in the momentum battle. They can always have the better positioning. They dictate, or they have greater say, I guess I should say, in how the next few turns will go as a result. Next up, we got Silvally Ground. Just continues getting incredible. Losing Levitate Bronzong as a potential check is really good, because a lot of the other forms of counterplay to it, they don't... It's not the hardest to get them in range of +2 multi-attack with, like, you know, chip that you can usually accrue off of U-turns. U-turn, multi-attack, SD, Rock Slide is just really good. And of course, Flame Charge is an option still over U-turn if you want to really go in on the sweeper mentality. I think that is probably the best just dedicated sweep in their tier. It's just really hard to pass up U-turn right now, I would say. Because when you think about a lot of its counterplay, right? You got like Rotomo, you got Serena, even like Vaporeon, Mudsdale. Mudsdale you want to multi, but Vaporeon, if it's not like a Starmie, if it's a bulky variant, which isn't very common, but I've seen a little bit more of lately, all these Pokemon really don't want to take that big U-turn hit. And like we were even talking about Rotomo, right? Really good momentum grabber. Grab Valley also definitely capitalized on the prominence of Guzzlord and Drapion. That's definitely in a meta past, but it being not the best knockoff absorber necessarily. I think we have others that you'd say are better, like itemless Vileplume or just Vileplume in general. But being one of the better ones and being able to do so much after switching in on a knockoff, and basically, you know, being face to face with a mon that you do beat decently from there, is really good. Similarly to Mudsdale, it's also a solid Volt deterrent. Now it does kind of suck that because the other Silvallies are so irrelevant, you don't have the surprise factor of like, oh, what if I'm Silvally Ground? Your Rotomo has to be careful. Or, no, they know you're Silvally Ground. Just stop. But I mean, they still do have to respect you, much like they have to respect Mudsdale. There's just not a whole lot that really wants to try to stop you. Even at +0, your multi-attack's doing a lot to checks like Vileplume, Vaporeon, Mudsdale. Edgequake coverage that's been a known great forever. It really doesn't take too much to get a winning endgame for this mon. It's really good right now. And it's probably number 2 on the list of potential suspect tests. I would say Goodra right now seems to be the one that Council is honing in on most. And then like Silvally Ground around there at 2. Next up we got Sylveon. Wish Sylveon is good. Lots of the defensive staples pair really well with Wish support. And Sylveon is, you know, it and Vaporeon both are the 2 best. Sylveon being ranked a little higher than Vaporeon is mostly because Sylveon does more than just Wish Pass. Or at least it has other things it can do. I'd say the big thing is Choice Spec Sylveon being so good. It's still a little bit awkward, I would say, because I don't know. I feel like every time I build with Spec Sylveon personally, I end up feeling like I'm not getting too much out of that slot other than a wall breaker. It's sort of got the Exploud syndrome where you click the funny button repeatedly and you do a lot of damage, but you're not getting necessarily a whole lot else in that spot. It's a great breaker, but a little slow as well. You know, you gotta go timid if you want to outspeed Modest Explode, if you want to outspeed Adamant Surfetched. So it's got a little bit awkward. It's on, like, how we mentioned earlier, the whole congested speed tier. Yeah, it's like sitting right under that speed tier, traffic logjam, whatever you want to call it. Which means it, just doesn't get to capitalize on anything in there. It's always getting outsped by those Pokemon, pretty much. Next up, Vileplume. Vileplume is a very good wall. It is very good. Strength Sap is a dumb move. And I was playing in, so PS has the tournaments room, right, where they just have tournaments ongoing all day. You can just join them, you can play some good old games, and sometimes when the ladder isn't very active, that's a better way to get some gameplay done. And I joined one yesterday, because, you know, I was feeling a little bored. And I had multiple games where Vileplume won off of preview. And while I don't think good teams necessarily are going to let Vileplume do that, especially when you consider some of the top dogs in the tier, right? Goodroid, Dragalge, Escavalier. Like, that shouldn't be happening too frequently where Vileplume just auto-wins, right? Even something like a Doraleon gives you at least some pain, or a Salazzle. But Vileplume is still really good because even in negative matchups, depending on your set, you can provide quite a bit. I would say that's where Vileplume really shines, right? So, like, Growth Vileplume, for instance. It can beat down a lot of defensive Pokemon that it otherwise stalemates versus. Sleep Powder, that's helpful for crippling, you know, a myriad of foes, like Dragalge, I'd say Escavalier, but they run Overcoat again. But, Dragalge and Salazzle would be the big two there. Corrosive Gas, again, cripples Dragalge if it wants to switch into you, cripples Escavalier, removing its recovery. You can get rid of Goodra's boosting item, which is, you know, really nice, gives your own team more leeway around it. And we've even seen that Trapper set with, like, Infestation. That's really good to get rid of potential, like, Toxic Protect Escavaliers, or at least just chip them down really effectively. Even if you're not necessarily, like, taking them out, you're going to cripple them so severely for the rest of the game that there's not really any recovery from there for your opponent. Defensively, I do think Vileplume is, like, moderately less useful than it has been in previous metas, because the fall off of Guzzlord. Also, the fighting types that are common are, like, I'd say it's more Toxicroak Passimian now, and even Machamp getting a little bit more usage, so you could honestly start to argue Vileplume should drop. But because of its versatility, I'm not willing to go that far yet. Despite it always running a defensive set of some kind, I just think the versatility within its move slots is really valuable. Next, let me talk about the A ranks. Now, I have Diancie in A rank. It and Xatu, I was very close to still having an A+. The only reason that I have them in A really just comes down to me not wanting to have this rank have 10 Pokemon. And with how the meta feels right now, I'm going to very cautiously say Diancie and Xatu are the bottom out of these options here. I think Xatu has more room to argue to be up here, 1000%. And I even made a post defending Xatu because there have been some people that have been super anti-Xatu lately. Been like, oh, Bronzong leaving was horrible for it, it's so much worse now, it does so much less, and I'm just like, no, you're not right. In fact, I would say you are wrong. Because Xatu still shuts down Mudsdale, and by shuts down, I mean it's pretty hard to rock up versus a Xatu with a Mudsdale team. Stunfisk Galar gets more usage nowadays, you definitely stop that boy from doing anything. You still also help a lot versus some of the choice locked Pokemon that we see running around. I'd say in Passimian, yeah. So in particular, Passimian being the big one. Passimian not super common necessarily, but getting a little bit more usage. Even if you want to go like all the way down here, there's not like a whole bunch. But being a good switch into CC is cool. You sort of check Serena. Your bulk's not good. That's always going to be the main knock against Xatu. The bulk for a defensive Pokemon is kind of weak. But it's almost always just enough to where you switch in and then you're able to roost off. And I'd also say Zatu's pretty decent at giving you some room to breathe around Sylveon ground. Yes, +2 Rock Slide does like 80 or 90. But you can pivot in on multi, you can pivot in on U-turn and get Helmet Chip. If you pivot on Sword Stance, you are in fact screwed, but you can run Foul Play pretty easily on Xatu right now. And that does like over half. So that could get Ground Valley in range of a Revenge Killer, and then that still has value to it. I would say the main thing that Xatu is going for it is similar to Vileplume. It's really versatile. Xatu gets a lot of random coverage moves. It's good with running status. It's able to pivot. Teleport being so good is so helpful. Xatu's able to support so many different Pokemon with Teleport. Again, talk about like Sylveon ground. It having no recovery means that it really doesn't want to have to take too many hits. Being able to guarantee other slow wall breakers like CB Guzzlord, Golurk, Specs Diancie. Safe entry is also really good. And Magic Bounce is also just so broken, man. Being able to disrupt what defensive Pokemon or just general utility Pokemon want to do will always hold a lot of value. Like, even if Xatu technically loses to every rocker that's common in a meta, it's really hard to say that Xatu's actually bad in that meta. Because at the end of the day, man, people will just throw their Xatu out versus an Aurorus, or a Rhydon, or an Aerodactyl. I'm just listing Pokemon that learn Stealth Rock here. Like, it doesn't matter if you OHKO me. I will still try to deny you rocks. Well, like, what's the point of my Xatu if I'm not playing it aggressively? And in Diancie and A, again, I think there's some people that want to put Diancie all the way down in A-. I think that's trolling a little bit. I think that's a very weird underrating of Diancie. And every time Diancie gets underrated in NU, it's pretty unjustified. Because people end up honing in so much on the, like, pretty do-nothing defensive Stealth Rock sets. And I'm just kind of there like, you complain about defensive Pokemon not making massive progress against team. How curious. But, I think a lot of it just comes down to offensive Diancie not picking up a whole bunch in usage yet. Some of that may have to do with the fact that there's so many other offensive threats in the tier that people are just opting for other options, or they feel that they need to run Diancie as a more bulky Pokemon. Diancie doesn't really handle a lot of the common offensive mons too well right now anyway. It's not that you get run down by them, it's more that, like, if you think about the ones people are really complaining about right now as potentially broken, I mean, it's like, you know, Sylveon ground, Copperajah. I mean, Goodra can run Iron Tail, so we'll throw Goodra in there. You know, so as a defensive Pokemon, it can struggle a little bit. Which is why I just personally am a bit more of a fan of the offensive sets. I think Mystical Fire Diancie is particularly cool right now. It does a lot of good in luring in certain checks to it, which I like. Next up's Golurk. Golurk's always been kind of hard mon for me to rate. Every VR update we do, I want to vote to drop it to A-, and then I vote to keep it in A anyway. Because I've seen Rock Polish Golurk go stupid in so many games. It is very good at sweeping because the mon has so much power behind it, and it's able to break pretty easily for itself in like early and mid-game spots. Similarly to Mudsdale and Sylveon ground as well, it's giving you that aggressive Volt Switch deterrent versus the Rotoms, which I do value at least somewhat. And it's also like not the worst defensively insofar as giving you a rock resist, at least in a tier where rock resists right now are otherwise limited to like durable rock resists are Mudsdale and then the X button. Everything else gets kind of run down. And while we don't have a lot of rock-type breakers, I do think Tyrantrum and Aerodactyl both, you know, I have Arrow jumping up a lot. I'll explain that one. But I think they've gotten a decent bit better. So even having just something that you can have guaranteeing you a 1v1, I hate saying that, a 1v1 where you come out on top. There we go. I think that's pretty valuable. Guzzlord in A. I voted this down, or I'm ranking this down from A+, because I could even see Guzzlord in A-. I'm being cautious and putting it in A for now. I think dark types in general aren't as useful. There was a period of time where, well, one Golurk, two Decidueye though also, were both pretty good. It felt like you in general just needed a Ghost Resist on every team. And Guzzlord ended up being the one that got a lot more run. Drapion, you'll also see that I voted it, or I have it ranked down here. I just think that need is a lot less now. Where I also think Guzzlord really suffered, though, is from Dragalge and Goodra both being so much better as a wall breaker. The Guzzlord just doesn't do the same, man. It's just a lot weaker. And with how Inu's not really strapped for good knockoff switch-ins, Banded Guzzlord just ain't that dude anymore. I think Specs has some merit, but at that point, again, now you're like directly competing with Goodra and Dragalge. At least with Band, you can say, I'm a physical attacker. It's just, you know, again, physical attacking Guzz has its different set of issues. Special attacking Guzz is trying to justify itself over two of the best to do it. At least, you know, in terms of Inu. And then, like, Protox sets, man, they just feel like they do nothing. Every team has a Cleric. Every team has ways to pivot around it. It just doesn't feel like an overly useful mon on a game-to-game basis like it used to. As I said, I'm very close to saying that it should be an A-. I'm just being cautious with it for now. This can always be updated later on, though. Salazzle and A, I really don't have a whole lot to say about. It's just still a decent it's still just a good nasty plot sweeper. Fast enough mon to where you get a lot of usefulness out of it from both a sweeping and even revenge killing perspective, because it's not like it's weak either, right, when unboosted. You're good enough to revenge kill stuff that you will want to revenge kill with this Pokemon. You come in on Pokemon like a Scavalier, if they're going for like a Toxic or a Protect, or even an Iron Head. You know, you come on a Rotomo Leaf Storm, you come in on Sylveon when it's trying to Wish Pass, you sit all over Vileplume. This mon has done the same thing for how long now? Let's move on. Oh, Encore, though, is also kind of cool for shutting down Vaporeon. Let's go back up to here. Vaporeon's an A. I think Vaporeon is, again, up there with Sylveon as best Wish Passers in the tier, because they're really the only Wish Passers. I've been trying out some more specially defensive Vaporeons lately to try to give myself more leeway around Goodra and Dragalge, and they've been not too bad. I think the main issue Vaporeon will always have is it's always going to feel like it's overwhelmed by something, because you'll always want to invest in a special bulk, but then that has you getting bent down by like Tauros and Silvally Ground. And then if you invest too much in physical bulk, well then, okay, Goodra. So I'm always a little bit lower, I think, on Vaporeon as a Pokemon than others are. But I think right now, at least, the Steel types that it's easily paired with do help take some of the pressure off of it. Like, just because of how many defensive Pokemon Vaporeon synergizes really well with, I think you can at least help ease the pressure on it, depending on how you decide to go with your EV spread. You know, you can pair it with Pokemon like Mudsdale and Xatu and Vileplume. That helps on the physical side. And as I mentioned, Steel types helping on the special side. There's room to figure it out. Now let's go to A-, and I'm already getting tired of talking. This is 34 minutes and I'm not even out of the A ranks. Once we get to B rank, we'll probably do it a little bit more quickly. Blastoise an A-. This is not a Pokemon that I'm going to talk about much at all, because it's done the same thing forever and it's still doing the same thing. It uses Shell Smash, it hopes to flinch your bulky water type with Dark Pulse. Explode an A-. I mean, this Pokemon's better for sure with Goodra gone, with Bronzong gone. I just don't think that it's necessarily all that different from the other breakers in its speed tier. It has one move that it wants to use a lot, and it will be very good if you're able to play aggressively and keep getting it in. Otherwise, it's limited pretty heavily by it providing no defensive utility to teams, and its speed tier being on the lower end of the very jumbled up mess that is the, like, you know, again, base 65-ish to 80-ish range. Passimian comes up next. Passimian's weird because it's not like it's a super good Pokemon. It's more that it just exists as the sort of accepted second or so best fighter and second or so best choice Scarf user. I don't really have a lot to say because Passimian, again, it's just... I mean, it's good at luring in Talon and potentially Okoing it with Rock Slide. It's good at U-turning a lot. It low-key feels kinda mediocre, but I don't want to underrate it because it has the combination of knockoff, U-turn, and a strong close combat, with a last slot that can be dedicated to a coverage move to potentially lure in a defensive answer, right? You know, like Earthquake could hit a Salazzle if it got really greedy. I don't know why you'd go Salazzle. It's more that you could run Earthquake to revenge kill Lazzle better. How about we say that? You have Rock Slide for Talon. You have Gunk Shot for Sylveon. I don't know, man. There's not a lot to say here. Starmie, in A-, I think it's a little bit worse because there's just a lot of special walls that can keep it contained. But it's still a really good breaker. Thunderbolt's always going to keep pressuring Vaporeon into wish spamming and risking the paralysis or the critical hit. Ice Beam obviously helps deal with the dragon types that otherwise might try to check you. It's like Exploud in that it really takes advantage of aggressive play where you're making those hard reads, hitting the Vaporeons, hitting the Goodras immediately as they switch into you. Because once you get like 1 or 2 predictions right, Starmie just really takes off. And that's where it separates itself from a Pokemon like Exploud, right? Because it's got the speed advantage. There's still a lot of Pokemon that outspeed and threaten a revenge kill from varying HP thresholds. But 361 speed is good enough to get you over a lot of other Pokemon, like Tauros, for instance, like Heliolisk, non-Scarf Heliolisk. And so, at least you're being forced to be revenge killed by a lot of time like Talonflame or Scarf Rotomo. Those are like the most common options I could think of. And those aren't very hard to switch around, which helps out Starmie. Tauros, he's still an A-. With Bronzong being gone, you're able to drop Throat Chop a lot more easily now. So you're able to fit maybe like Rock Slide or Work Up. Rock Slide being kind of cool to just deny the Talonflames from pivoting around and fishing for burns on you. And then Work Up potentially helping you just break down something like a Vaporeon or maybe a Vileplume if you use Work Up as it switches in. But I think at that point, you Work Up and then you go for the Oko once you have it with enough chip to where +1 Body Slam KOs. Because that way, you don't have to risk Effect Spore twice, only once. Toxicroak in A-, I agree with everyone that says this mon is either really good or really bad on a game-to-game basis. But compared to the other fighting types, Machamp and Sirfetch'd, which I have both in B, I'll get to that. I think Croak is just better because it gives you a little bit more defensively. It's not like it has great bulk, but at least it does something, man. It resists fighting, it's immune to water. And I just don't value Sirfetch'd's first impression at all. I feel like with how the metagame is sort of forced to be a little bit faster right now, well, that would help with first impression if anything. I feel like if anything, we'll get to that. Let me get to Sirfetch'd later. I like what Croak does as a wall breaker, being able to take advantage of the really high Vaporeon usage, really high Vileplume usage as well. If you think about like +2 Toxicroak, not a whole lot in the tiers checking it reliably, and finding chances to boost is not really hard. You know, again, Vileplume you set on Vaporeon really easily. You could set up on certain variants of Escavalier as well. You need to be at like full health to do it, but you can still do it. And of course, there's always going to be the big claim of, hey, my +2 low kick, if I'm adamant with a life orb, has a damage roll to KO Mudsdale from full. So that's funny. And you got Tyrantrum in A-. I like Tyrantrum on Hyper Offense. I think the mon just synergizes really well with every other option you have on that archetype. And with Bronzong being gone, again, that's just like one less sturdier head smash switch in. It's a good deterrent to Talonflame as well. You know, just having an offensive mon that revenge kills T-Flame instead of T-Flame revenge killing the offensive mon. I like that. Alright, Aerodactyl and B+, how do I defend this one? Bronzong leaving means that you are no longer strapped for figuring out or you're no longer struggling to figure out your coverage as much, which I really like for more dedicated wall breaker sets. I think Aerodactyl's speed tier is also just an insane blessing. It, you know, usurps Talonflame as the fastest unboosted Pokemon in the tier. Also is a good offensive check to T-Flame. You do have to risk getting Will-O-Wisped every time you switch into it, but Heal Bell support, not hard to find. I'd say another cool thing is if you've watched this most recent week of NU Snake, you'll see some Aerodactyl, like, Stealth Rock set usage. People have been trying out Stealth Rock, Stone Edge, Earthquake, and then whatever move last, whether it's Toxic or Roost. Which, again, we're seeing people experiment a little bit more with Aerodactyl, which I think is cool. I already thought it was at least decent enough when we had Bronzong around, because yes, picking your coverage was not fun. So there were matchups where you were pretty dead weight, but it was still pretty clear what niche it could have, at least. I think now with Bronzong gone, coverage being easy for offensive sets to figure out, and also just, again, Toxic becoming so much freer of a move to target Mudsdale with, because you don't ever have to worry about, you know, oh, what if I'm Rocks, Edgequake, Toxic, and then I Q into Bronzong? Oh, I have lost. The mod has just opened up a lot, and I think that we need to start respecting it quite a bit. Then we got Braviary and B+. This is a Pokemon that I am pretty unsure where I really feel that it should be, but I think Bronzong being gone should be pretty good for this, for like every set. You know, you can think about how Bronzong did check the sub-bulk up sets with insane ease just because Iron Defense meant you boosted faster and also weren't ever going to be broken through. And in Bronzong would check, obviously, anything that's like Scarf or Bandit or whatever. So having that out of the way makes me want to be cautiously optimistic with Braviary, but we'll see how it actually goes. Say they're like Decidueye B+, I'm not entirely sure where I really feel that it should be. I've tried out Defog Decidueye, it's okay. You check Rotomo until it tricks you, and then you become very sad, though. Frankly, so I got Delmise in B. You could probably flip Decidueye and Delmise, because Delmise is the sturdier Silvally ground check. Anyhow, Drapion in B+, because this Pokemon sucks, and I could drop it to B and still feel fine. We already said that if we think Dark-type isn't as useful defensively as it has been, but Drapion's also just so weak, man. Mudsdale's everywhere. Silvally ground now is also everywhere, so you don't get to spam knockoff as easily. And while you can run Aqua Tail last really easily, I always would rather have a different Pokemon for whatever role I want Drapion to do. That's just the long and the short of it, man. There's nothing that Drapion could do that is particularly unique or that stands out enough from the other Pokemon that maybe would take up the team slot that I'm using it in, to where I'm like, okay, you know what? Yeah, let's use Drapion today. That's just not it. Mantine and B+, it's like kind of shitty at checking everything that it wants to check, but good enough at doing it too, to where I kind of want to use it sometimes, right? It's like that blanket special wall that oftentimes is still getting threatened with an Oko, or not an Oko, with like heavy chip, but it makes you feel safer against certain stuff. It's also a ground immune, and I have this desire to put a ground immune on every team. So sometimes in my water type, being able to be the ground immune, I value. Rhydon and B+, it's another ground type. It's a flying resist. And with Bronzong gone, you do have a lot more leeway to throw off your stab attacks. You don't have to worry about Levitate Zong almost mandating Smackdown on it, which is really nice. You don't have a great matchup against the hazard removers at all, but Megahorn at least lets you bonk them as they switch into you, which is pretty good. And you also check a lot of the other common Pokemons like Salazzle, Talonflame. I'd say, I mean, yeah, you check Dragalge if you run enough speed, and the Dragalge isn't running max speed. So I guess there's that. You know, you're faster to Copperajah depending on investment. It's just a really good offensive stealth rocker. Snorlax, I have in B+. I think we've seen enough of success out of it to give it at least a slight nudge up. I still think that it is kind of underwhelming, but having a blanket special wall right now that can check Goodra is pretty cool. So I do rate it decently for that. And in the set that we've seen a lot of, like Body Slam, Earthquake, Heat Crash, Rest, I'd say the games that it's been used in, it's been pretty good overall, so sure. Serena in B+ as well, it's like one of the few forms of removal that's not just saying put a Xatu on your team or run a Rotomo. So get some just inherent value there. It's one of the better ways to get a knockoff on Talonflame as well, which could potentially open up options like Salazzle to sweep a little more reliably. It checks Silvally Ground, but again, we come to that point of U-turn, especially +2 U-turn, being really annoying for much of Silvally Ground's counterplay. This next Pokemon is Delmise. Another mon that I'm going to be a little cautiously optimistic with. Slight raise up on my VR, because it's one of the better defensive answers to Silvally Ground, because you resist, unlike Vileplume, you resist ground, while still not being weak to U-turn. And Flame Charge ain't really going to do a whole lot to you. And you're going to obviously threaten to Power Whip Oko. Similar to Serena, one of the few other forms of hazard removal that is not just simply Rotomo or a Xatu. So that can give you some certain use out of the Pokemon. And just in general, because of how strong Delmise is naturally, it's not like it's some do-nothing defensive Pokemon. Like, frankly, kind of like Mantine is. Delmise, just between its two stab moves, Power Up and Poltergeist, it's able to bother quite a bit of the potential mons you'd switch into it. You know, outside of, like, the Dark types we've mentioned, and then an itemless Vileplume. I think in a fair amount of matchups, Delmise is frankly pretty annoying for teams to deal with defensively. For Ocelot and B, I'm still pretty high on those hyper offense spike stack teams, and we've also seen more use of it on balance. Heliolisk down to B. It really only flourishes in metas where offense is super common, because that lets Scarflisk be pretty good. Offense isn't super common right now, so Scarflisk loses a fair bit of its usefulness outside of teams that just need the speed boost. And we're talking like the insane speed boost, because that mon is really fast as a Scarfer. And its specs just isn't too good of a breaker right now. It's just a lot of defensive Pokemon, or Pokemon in general, running around that, you know, annoy Specs Lisk as a breaker. You know, if we just look at them, Goodra, AV Raja, Dragalge. I mean, Mudstale prevents Volt Switch. Vileplume is at least a soft check. You know, even Golurk, man. Immune to its dual stabs. Maybe Boots is an okay set. I know people have talked about that before, but I've never been high on it. Entity Female all the way up to B. It feels like a much better Scarfer now without Bronzong, because it's a lot easier to pop Escavalier and Copperajah with Mystical Fire to help get them in range of later being 2-hit KO'd by Expanding Force if they switch into it. And then Healing Wish is also really cool support for wall breakers like Copperajah, AV in particular, like Sylveon Ground. Sylveon Ground's like a particularly cool teammate for Entity, I feel, because it really lets you capitalize on that whole wall break early, sweep late mentality. Or I guess more game plan. Now we can talk about like both Sirfetch'd and Machamp. I have them both in B. I just don't think either of them is a particularly amazing wall breaker, but I would put Machamp at least on par with it at this point, because unlike Sirfetch'd, Machamp does not care about Talonflame and Vileplume switching into it. It's got Guts, so the status fishing doesn't phase it, and it can just keep spamming Facade all game. We've also seen a little bit of Assault Vest Machamp usage now. Similar to Snorlax, it's just a blanket special wall that can give you more leeway around Goodra. Like, genuinely, I have not seen a Sirfetch'd really do anything in a long time. And I think part of it is because of how you have to cater a team so heavily around Sirfetch'd. It's not an easy Pokemon to switch in because it's really frail. And it doesn't do anything for you defensively. I think first impression is pretty meh, because you are, without Chip, you really aren't revenge killing a lot of the common offensive Pokemon with it. I mean, like Goodra, you got a crit also, unless you run CB. And I've seen too many Surfetch not crit, but I mean, think about it, like Valley Ground doesn't really take much from first impression. Salazzle obviously doesn't take a whole lot from first impression. He pops Starmie, that's cool. But like Teatrum, Aerodactyl, what about others? Tauros, I don't think would take enough to where you're really happy about it. You know, Passimian, you're not revenge killing that. Golurk, if it's got a rock polish up, have fun. Lamau. I don't value its priority at all. I just really don't. Quagsire, it's a B. It could be B+, but I'm not as high on it as other people are that really love spamming it. But Unaware Quag is really good right now for shutting down Valley Ground. Generally just a solid team disruptor as well. Able to spread status really easily with like Scald, Toxic. It's really annoying to kill, of course, because of Recover. Mostly, my main issue with Quagsire is just that it forces teams to be really slow. At least in my experience. And in this metagame where you do kind of want to have teams not be fast-paced, but you don't want to drag the average speed down too much, it can be a little hard to get Quag to fit on a team. Next up, Scrafty. Scrafty, I think, is a weird mon. It kind of got fucked because of the whole downward trend of Dark-type usefulness, but it also didn't because it offers, I think, generally more than the other Dark-types do. Because, you know, Bulk Up Scrafty is a really good sweeper. It's similarly still just obese as a special wall. So it can help, you know, again, give you more leeway around Goodra if you want to cite a specific special wall breaker. It's like you turn Valley Ground as well, in that you get a lot of early and mid-game usage out of it, just switching into attacks, spreading knockoffs to get item removal. Self-sufficient with rest, but not in the troll way like Snorlax is, because you have Shed Skin to wake up. And in late game, once you've maybe gotten rid of their Deance or Sylveon, you can generally bulk up pretty easily and sweep. Because the sad Talonflame does not do much damage to you with Brave Bird. It is really depressing to watch. And we got Wheezing to just round out the B rank here. I like Levitate Wheezing right now because it is probably the best Valley Ground counter available. And it just, you know, again, it checks other Pokemon that are pretty common, like Passimian, like Toxicroak, although Toxicroak, you know, what are you doing back? I guess you're wisping it. You check Tauros, which, not necessarily super common, but you take like under half from Body Slam, and you can Pain Split Up versus it, or burn it. Good knockoff absorber as well. You can run itemless if you want. I still prefer Helmet to punish U-turn, particularly against Valley Ground. But if you need to switch into knockoffs from Passimian or Guzzlord or Drapion or what have you, it's one of the better options because it's not reliant on its item to be useful. Oh, now we get really into the dredges. Almost at an hour, but let's get it. So Araquanid, the premier like Vaporeon abuser. I also just think Subtox Araquanid is like very annoying, especially for slower teams. Subtox Araquanid can eat them alive. There's some horrible matchups for this Pokemon, which really makes it hard for me to want to preach this mon too much higher than B-. But when you get the matchups against the standard Vaporeon builds, I think Subtox Arac is actually pretty strong. Because Vaporeon oftentimes will be their dedicated liquidation answer, or like water type check. Some obviously, well, you can still queue like Dragalge as another Pokemon, but Dragalge takes quite a bit from liquidation. You know, it's not wanting to really switch into you repeatedly, so that helps you out there. Arcanine, it helps that Talonflame isn't like... Talonflame, I think, is a lot closer, like we said earlier. The S-Mons aren't too much higher than the A+ Mons anymore in my eyes. So that helps Arcanine. And also, the need for maybe some more Copper Raja counterplay. Well, Arcanine's the closest thing to a Raja counter, I think, other than like Doublade. So, there's a little bit more reason to use him now. Aurora's still in B-, so obviously the current VR has Aurora's in B-, but that's with Hail as a whole being still, like, represented. You know, so the Slush Rushers being around, that's why we had Aurora's in B-. I'm keeping it in B-Nice from now entirely because of recency bias with using an offensive Stealth Rock set with Meteor Beam that actually did feel pretty good. It's a very similar set to what we ran last gen in NU on Aurorus. Obviously there's no Meteor Beam, but the idea of offensive Stealth Rock is just still quite solid. You don't like Vaporeon at all as a Pokemon? Like, that is not a fun time? But other than that, I haven't really found matchups where you're just like, wow, useless. Other than maybe, I don't know, Snorlax or Scrafty. But that's stuff where like a lot of special attackers, unless they have a super effective move, are probably going to be kind of sad anyway. The Blade in B-, this Mon is not very good. It just doesn't do, right now especially, it doesn't do anything that you want a Steel type to do. I think on certain offenses, it's still got some value, but that's about it. Doraleon in B-, I thought it'd be a fair bit worse after the the loss of Bronzong. It's honestly still pretty decent though, just as a wall breaker. A lot of the cores that it was beating prior to Zong leaving, it still is like faring decently into. It's just kind of unfortunate that now you're dealing with Steel types that you don't really beat down. But it's still respectably strong. I mean, it's like the Blade in that it doesn't do anything you want a Steel type to. But we kind of just deal with that. Garbodor in B-, this is actually a drop from B. I just think it's worse than Wheezing. I don't think Spikes have shown to be any better than they were. And if I want a Spiker, I'm going Frostlass. Inteleon in B-, it is a fast Pokemon that, it is like one of the heaviest matchup fishes ever, man. You pick this Pokemon in a tournament setting when you just don't think you're facing a Vaporeon. That's really it. Galarifisk, it's a Volt blocker that doesn't lose to the coverage from the most common Volt Switch user, which I find pretty nice. The Xatu matchup seems worse on paper than it actually is, because you run, like... So, like, Stone Edge is pressuring Xatu to roost pretty much anytime it switches in. Or you have Sludge Bomb to force poisons onto Xatu, and then again play into the whole make it roost repeatedly mentality. It's like... It's an aggressively passive Pokemon. Like, this Mon does not do a whole lot other than sit around and just hope for something good to happen. But I've seen enough teams use it successfully to where it's like, I don't like it as a Pokemon, but I'm not gonna ignore the success. It's kind of pointless. And in the last Mon, in B-, I got Vanillix. I still think it's a fine enough wall breaker. And it definitely punishes teams that are not using a Scavalier as their Steel type. Because the combination of Stealth Rock plus Hail Chip is just netting you an extra, you know, like what? Eighth of the foe's health if it's Blizzard resistant. You know, you talk about like Copperajah trying to switch into you. Every calc you just gotta add that 12.5 to if you've got Rocks up. Which does really help break apart certain teams. Now, there are some matchups where you just kind of hold the L. Like Vaporeon plus a Scavalier, you're not breaking that. And Vanillix doesn't give you anything defensively either. But it's got a decent speed tier for this meta, I would say. Which, you know, has me just a little bit excited about the Mon. Realistically, Aurorus and Vanillix both may end up in C rank when it's all said and done. But for now, I'm going to give them a little bit more credit. Just in the meantime. And now we get to C rank. Now, I threw Comfy in C. Comfy liked the fact that it could beat Bronzong. It doesn't beat the other Steels. I mean, it beats Raja, technically, because Raja's HP is so large. So if you run like that Sub-Seed Calm Mindset, you Leech Seed Copperajah switches in and then you sub up. The main problem is Talonflame is still really good. And it's gonna beat you all the time. Vileplume is really good, and it just shuts down the, you know, like, cheese set stuff that you want to do with Comfy. Dragalge is really good. I mean, it's a dragon type that beats you. Oh no, Comfy at this point just feels like it's genuinely nothing more than a, pick and pray Mon. You're just hoping for the dream matchup. It lacks any real game-to-game consistency. Druddigon in C. In a meta where Xatu is really good, it's hard to justify Druddigon being unranked. But it is really hard to also justify getting it on teams, because the other dragon types are oftentimes just better. Alone Executor, like we added at the very beginning of the video, we've seen him more lately. On Arceus has used him multiple times on Sand. I was preaching the good word months ago. Yeah, months ago. It's like, again, the current Steel types, you Flamethrower them. And overall, it's just a really strong Pokemon anyway, so it's hard to really ever say that this mon is bad. Noted competition, obviously, right now, but it does give you a little bit different of defensive utility, just because of the typing. Resisting Ground is cool, meaning you always get to take big advantage of Mudsdale. And you kind of have a little room around Raja. Heavy Slam does over half, so that kind of sucks, but, you know, a little room. You still take heavy advantage of Rotomo as well. You still take heavy advantage of Vaporeon as well. Not an incredible mon, but serviceable enough. Ferroseed, like, it could be unranked, it could be ranked, it really doesn't matter. It's a Steel type and a Spiker in one slot and a Water Resist. In my eyes, it's just roll compression, and I think it's decent enough, based on my experience with it, to keep it ranked. Sand as a whole here, Gigalith, Sandslash, and Lycanroc all get to be talked about. Again, I think it's seen enough Tour success to keep it ranked. And hey, if every other weather has been broken enough to get dealt with in some way, surely Sand can't be that bad. Losing Bronzong is quite helpful for the two Sand Sweepers. Running into Mudsdale on a really consistent basis definitely hurts, but together, they're able to overwhelm it pretty reasonably. And a lot of the other ground type checks, you're just not worried about having to overwhelm them because it's not hard. You're talking like Serena, you're talking about like Rotomo, Vaporeon, which often is not fully physically defensive, so it's not really an effective check to, say, a +2 Life Orb Sandslash. It's a fine pick, pretty much. Kingdra in C. I could unrank this Pokemon, I wouldn't care, but we'll keep it in C for now. Again, we harken back several months now to why Kingdra's struggling. It's been pretty meh ever since Light Clay was banned by Yu, because it has to get 2 turns to set up if it wants to both do damage and outspeed Pokemon. And oftentimes, it's really hard to get both those turns. And in Sylveon also being super common just isn't really helping it at all. Even a Scavalier, if a Scavalier wants to badly enough, with Hail being out of the picture now, it probably could go back to running Shell Armor if it just wanted to deny the Kingdra users any degree of happiness. So there's that. Ninjask. Mon sucks, but I can't bring myself to truly acknowledge it as unrankable yet because it's still really fast. And there's probably matchups where it can sweep after 100 turns of chip damage, so sure. So Valley Fairy, this is maybe a weird ranking, especially with how good Ground Valley is, but I do think Bronzong leaving has helped. It's similar to like Aerodactyl, except much worse, where Bronzong leaving helped its coverage woes out a fair bit. Multi-attack, Rock Slide, Flame Charge is like decent enough. You're still hard-walled by poisons, but I think it's okay enough to be considered a C-rank Pokemon. Would definitely need to see it get actual usage. I think it's been used once so far in a new Snake, and I don't remember what it did, but I think it has at least some promise. Sneasel, it's a fast Dark type, man. It can't be that bad. You know, unlike Drapion, it outspeeds the Silvally Ground, and it misses the second triple axle, and it gets OHKO'd by multi-attack, but that's fine. Sneasel admittedly revenge kills quite a bit in this metagame. Talk about, like, I was gonna say Starmie, then I remembered that there's save speed, but like Specs Heliolisk, if you ever run into one of those, let me know. But revenge kills that, revenge kills Goodra, Specs Indeedee, although most of them are Scarf. But you do revenge kill Specs, a non-Scarf Rotomo, obviously like stuff like Dragalge, non-Flame Charge Silvally Ground, non-boost Speed Boost Golurk, and a Togedemaru last, because I have at least had a couple of teams where a Scarf Togedemaru felt like the right fit, and then I put it on the team, and it didn't feel that bad. That is over an hour of me talking about my personal VR, yo. That should have been illegal. But I hope you guys enjoyed this. Obviously, there are a lot of other VRs here as well, so if you want to travel onto the NU subforum, you can check some of these out. So, like, you know, see this one, he has Silvally Ghost all the way up in B-, for example. Let's see. Togki. Togki's got, Copperajah listed as the best Pokemon in the tier. Turk Dog, he's, let's see, where's, like, a take that maybe would get some people a little, upset. He's actually, like, quite high on Heliolisk. He has it all the way up in A-, and also doesn't really have the dark types dropping off much at all. Well, he doesn't have Drapion dropping off. I guess he's all his Guzzlord going down to A. Lucario, he's shitting on Rotomo. Weird. But, you know, again. I'm a fan of Mystics. What does he say? Yeah, so he has Diancie as, like, the second best Pokemon in the tier. So there's a take that I'm sure a lot of people disagree with. But, at the end of the day, it's personal VR. And it's Pokemon, so, like, everyone's gonna have different opinions. I don't really think anyone is necessarily too out there with the things that they're posting in here, so hey. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Oh, God. Recording is hard when it goes on for this long. Let me know down below what you feel about the NU meta. And I'll catch y'all next time. I don't know what will be next time. Maybe alive? We'll see. Just gotta make sure that the ladder actually has people playing. But whatever next time is, I'll catch y'all then. Peace.